Hello, my name is Camilla and welcome to my talk on the development as of of the psychedelic compassion experience scale to predict outcomes in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. So who am I? I'm a psychiatry registrar in South London, about 2 months away from completing my training when I returned from maternity leave. I've just had a second daughter 2 months ago, and I'm doing an MD Res, a slightly shorter version of a PhD with King's College London, funded by Mental Health Research UK, in contextual factors in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. I've been involved in psilocybin research since I volunteered as a female psychiatrist and guide in the open-label pilot study Imperial. This was a very rewarding experience for me. I I guided 22 dosing sessions for 11 patients, and I collaborated in qualitative research there with Rosalind Watts. So I'm doing my training at the Maudsley, and so I move now to the King Psychedelic Trials Group. My MD Res aims form part, my MD Res aims form part of the tertiary aims of a NIHR-funded feasibility RCT study in psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, which was a grant got by James Rucker, my supervisor. And these are my aims. And so part of this is to develop and validate a scale to measure the types of experiences that people have during a guided psilocybin trip that predict improvements in depression afterwards to be used within research and hopefully in the future in clinical settings. And then it's possible the scale can be validated to be used for other pathologies and other psychedelics. This slide shows you the steps of scale development, which is actually split into item development, the first 3 items there, scale development, the next 3, and then scale evaluation, the last 3. I shall now present to you my findings from the identification of domain and item generation, content validity, and the pre-testing of questions. So the domain here is psychedelic experiences that lead to improvements in depression. And the purpose is to create a short, simple scale that can be used after dosing to predict outcome. The second step is to describe the domain and provide preliminary conceptual definition of it. In this case, what are the types of psychedelic experiences that lead to positive outcomes or improvements in depression? I have used both deductive and inductive processes in order to do this. Deductive by way of looking at the existing literature on this, and inductive from my own experience of being a guide and of carrying out qualitative research. Bill Richards and Peter Gasser have categorized different healing experiences as peak or mystical, archetypal, psychodynamic, and cognitive. And whilst peak or mystical experiences are highly predictive of positive change, these other types of experience are also very important, which is why our scales other than the MEQ or altered states of consciousness are needed. So the recent psychological conceptualization have involved ideas related to ACT, or kind of third wave therapy. So ideas of connection and acceptance, psychological flexibility, emotional breakthrough, facilitated access to emotions, relational embeddedness. This was the first model of contextual factors that I constructed, not only including the psychological mediators of change that you can see in the middle there, but also these pre-dose predictive factors, but just ignore those for now and just focus in the middle. So from the kind of, from a thorough literature review and from the qualitative study, I sort of came up with these ideas, which I split into emotional experiencing, inter, and or transpersonal connection, and cognitive changes. However, I sort of wasn't quite happy with this kind of categorization. So as a guide, first of all, So when you're kind of describing the domain, you also need to specify the dimensions of the domain. So as a guide in the pilot study Imperial, I also noticed how many people appeared to have experiences of compassion either towards themselves or others. And in particular, I wondered if the three components of self-compassion as constructed by Kristen Neff as self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness would provide a better framework in which to categorize the helpful psychedelic experiences. And so I decided to use these as the dimensions of the domain. I'll show you now some quotes from participants in the Imperial study, which relate to these three dimensions. So these quotes relate to self-kindness, and I'll let you read them so you have a break from my voice. And then these quotes relate to common humanity. And these quotes relate to mindfulness. I started to think, though, that these experiences didn't fit that well into compassion experiences. And I felt that the types of experiences people were having with psilocybin were broader than the components of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness alone. And so they have now shifted into inner therapist, connection, and emotional experiencing. There's something very specific about a psychedelic healing experience in that it seems to always be uniquely person-centered and almost as if it's sort of custom-made for the person. Something which I think in itself is a strong predictor of positive outcome. And so I wanted to capture this in the scale. Therefore, I changed the self-kindness component to inner therapist. Here are some more quotes from participants in the Imperial study to show this further. So there seems to be this activation of an inner wisdom or inner therapist that sort of advises you about healthy life choices. And then, so in terms of common humanity, which is the sort of awareness that we're not alone in our suffering, but that everyone suffers, is can be one type of psychedelic experience. However, there's also the sense of something slightly different to that, like more of an interconnectedness or a connectedness to nature or to spirituality, as well as the experiences of ego dissolution, which are definitely different than this idea of common humanity. The dimension of mindfulness also appeared limited in that helpful psychedelic experiences appear to have an added dimension of intensity, and that some emotional experiences would be more in line with psychoanalytical ideas of catharsis and abreaction. And therefore I renamed this component emotional experiencing, although that's then back to my original naming as well. And so my three a priori components for the scale are inner therapist, connection, and emotional experiencing. And therefore I think rather than compassion experience scale, I think it's the psychedelic compassion experience scale, which is a bit of a mouthful. I might have to amend that. Since starting to create my scale, 3 other scales are already in progress. The What's Connection scale, the Psychological Insight Questionnaire, and the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory. And it's important, not to just create another instrument for the sake of it. However, the psychological insight question and the emotional breakthrough inventory don't seem to have the added dimension of kind of connection in them. And then the what's connection scale, which overlaps more conceptually with mine, although uses different language, is a 23 item scale. So much sort of quite a bit longer than I'm aiming to make. And also it's a scale that's measuring how connected you feel within the last 2 weeks, rather than it being a scale to be used directly after dosing to kind of quantify experiences. So I generated items for the scale using both deductive and inductive methods, creating at least twice as many questions as I desired to be in the final scale. My first scale had 28 items, and it included antithetical pairs of questions. So there were 5 pairs of questions for inner therapist, which are here. 4 pairs of questions for connection, and 6 pairs of questions for emotional experiencing. I used a 6-point scale using the following wording, and I sent this out to previous healthy volunteer psychedelic trial participants, including colleagues and some previous psychedelic trial patients who were on our NIHR steering committee, for feedback on wording using Qualtrics. Generally, the feedback was good and they felt I was covering the right kind of experiences. However, they said the questions were repetitive, particularly with the addition of the negative questions, which were also confusing. For example, answering the question, I experienced no change in my sense of intrinsic self-worth. First of all, how can you experience nothing? And if you were trying to answer that with definitely or not at all, it's a bit of a brain teaser. So I got rid of the negative questions and changed the wording of the introduction question and the scale to a Likert agreement-disagreement scale in order to give participants more chance of disagreeing with the statement. Here's the scale now half as long, but I've added 1 more item in connection to try and capture the idea of ego dissolution. This is my consciousness expanded outside my own mind. So there are 15 items in total. There are now 5 for inner therapist, 4 for connection, and 6 for emotional experiencing. I sent a content validity form to numerous experts I knew in the UK and the USA, explaining the conceptual development of the domain and dimensions, and then asking them to first choose which component they think each item fits into, and then to ask them to rate how strongly they agree whether each item is measuring each component. I got 10 responses, and there was general feedback that the use of prison of the mind, although often described in people who were depressed, was not the best wording. And I enjoyed this particular quote from an expert who I very much respect. His initials happen to be BR. Also, it was obvious that when I'd written feelings and insight or feelings and belief in the same item, that these created confusion between the inner therapist and emotional experiencing components. So I did a Fleiss Kappa on the component rating, and I performed this using Excel, using a broken down version of the formula. So with the 15 items, the coefficient was 0.64. From this table, which is a human construct, not really based on anything, there's what you would call a substantial agreement there. So this I did on the second question, the Likert of agreement and disagreement with my components. And this is a proportion agreement, so there was 0.92. This sounds very high, although this doesn't take into account the chance. Now, if I remove 3 items, 1 from inner therapist about experiencing a positive change in my beliefs and feelings about myself, and 2 from emotional experiencing, so bodily sensations led to new insight, and a question, I was able to go in and through emotions or memories, I get a Fleiss Kappa of 0.78, which is a slightly higher substantial agreement. So these are the items that I have removed, 2 from emotional experiencing and 1 from inner therapist. And I've changed these 3 items And I believe that the top item about discovering new insights and feelings of love would have much improved if, this top question, I discovered new insights about myself, that question would very much improve the inter-rater agreement compared to I discovered new insights and feelings of love towards myself because of the confusion with inner therapist and emotional experiencing. So this is the most recent form of the scale, which we shall be giving to the patients on the CIDR trial. That has just been given the go-ahead by MHRA and HRA, which is great. So there we are, there's the 12-item scale. So thank you for listening, and I'll take your questions in a bit.